200 years ago, the Lakota were the unrivaled rulers of the Great Plains. 800 years ago, before there was a Wild West, before the Pilgrims landed at Massachusetts, where were the Lakota? Who commanded this stretch of North America? Who were the unrivaled rulers of the Great Plains? Recent dramatic discoveries in genetics have pulled back the curtain on one of the most epic periods in all of pre-European North American history. My name is Nathaniel Jeanson. I'm the research biologist with Answers in Genesis, and this is They Had Names. If you're watching this and you're Native American, I invite you to stick with me to the end, where we've got some future research, some future projects we're trying to solve. Would love to have your help in all this. This video follows the content in the recently released book, They Had Names, and this episode covers specifically much of chapters 6 and 7. In our previous episode, we looked at the biggest secret in all of pre-European North America, that being the long and very detailed migration of the Algic or Algonquian peoples through Alaska down the western coast of Canada, across the Great Plains, across the Mississippi, which I teased, saying there was a great battle here, but never gave the actual answer, and then how they eventually reached the Atlantic Ocean. They almost didn't reach the Atlantic Ocean, at the same time that they were landing in Alaska in the AD 900s, somebody else was moving into North America, or north of the Rio Grande, from Mexico. If you've ever been to Mexico and you've seen the Mayan ruins, the Aztec ruins, you know they had a great fondness for stone-built, flat-topped pyramids. You don't find stone-built pyramids in the United States. You do find flat-topped pyramids. And so there are visual reminders or hints of Central America littered all across the North American U.S. landscape. This mound here at Cahokia, which is in Illinois just east of St. Louis, modern St. Louis, is the biggest earthwork structure either in North America or in the entire Americas. Flat-top mound reminds the viewer of the flat-top mounds in Central America. It reminded people of Central America from the earliest days, 1800s. If you go to Aztalan State Park in Wisconsin, in the middle almost of nowhere, between Milwaukee and Madison on I-94, you will find a flat-topped mound. If you go south to Moundsville, Alabama, there's a whole host of mounds at that park. Here's one of the Chieftain's Mound that was flat-topped as well. Georgia has flat-top mounds. We could go on and on just to put these on the map. There's a lot of eastern North America that has flat-top mounds. So Aztalan, Wisconsin, Cahokia, St. Louis, Moundsville in Alabama, and Etowah in Georgia. There's, in fact, an entire culture, archaeologically, the Mississippian culture, that rose in the AD 900s, beginning here in Cahokia and another spot further south, and expanded 950. Then this green is 1000. This is the AD 1100s, and then 1200s in the very dark green, expanded outward. There is a Native American tribe that describes coming from Mexico and eventually expanding to a reach that bears a lot of resemblance to this archaeological culture. This group said we came initially from the coast of Mexico. I don't think they were the rulers. They talked about the ancient rulers who were here in Mexico in conflicts with them, getting tired of their role in their fights, and eventually just sending people basically eastward, northward, to east of the Mississippi. There's hints in this people group's record that they may have even reached the Florida Keys, if not the Caribbean, which would be remarkable. As they continued to expand, they reached, they said, the Wabash River and those rivers that eventually emptied into the Mississippi, which would include, technically, the Ohio. So if you're looking carefully at this slide, you'll see this is the Natchez. It's the Natchez peoples who said, we came from Mexico. They described this migration, the series of migrations, the geographical extent of their empire, which, again, if you compare them, sounds a whole lot like the extent of the Mississippian culture. At contact, the Natchez looked nothing like this. They're just a small band in the Mississippi, Louisiana area, and there's a reason why, at contact, they looked nothing like what they used to be. You may have noticed on this map of the Mississippian culture, and I'm going to use Mississippian and Natchez as synonyms as we go forward for reasons I laid out in the book as to why I think these two are essentially the same thing. There's a reason that Natchez culture shrunk so much, and to understand why and how and why this site was the greatest battle in all of pre-European North American history, I think back to a visit I made to this place, Cahokia, in Illinois, just east of modern St. Louis, last year. I highly encourage a visit. there's so much architecture here that gives you a sense of who these people were and what they tried to accomplish. If you stand in front of this mound, so this is an aerial view, but I stood more off screen where I could kind of have it all in front of me. This mound is 100 feet high, but it's also a gigantic sprawl of a mound, 22 million cubic feet of fill. And even at a distance, it's hard to get the mound out of your peripheral. It's almost like, again, Chieftain's Mound. The chieftain said, let's build this big, let's build it wide, so that everyone has to basically look here and be reminded of who's in charge. Even the slopes that he put on his mound, there's several levels you can see here. There's a platform here. Again, some of this mound is degrading with time, sadly, as so many of these do, but there's still stuff preserved. You can walk up here, you can walk up here. There's augmented reality, so you can see how it used to look, where you can use your phone to see, okay, there's a palisade here and such. Anyway, you walk up the main steps here. The angle that I think this picture does justice to keeps you in suspense. So even how the chieftain forced any visitor to approach him, so you can't see what's above here. There, again, would have been a fence up here to further obstruct your view. Then there'd be another level, another set of stairs to go up, or path to go up where it's obstructed view. This guy on the biggest mound, looking down on all of you, 100 feet in the air, and keeps you in anticipation of what am I going to find out next. If your goal is, let's keep people intimidated, he did exactly what he needed to do. It's not just on the top of this mound where you find a fence. The mound itself and area in front of it, and I'll show you another picture here to give you a sense of how far it went. The whole central precinct was surrounded by a palisade. So there's very clear, here's restricted access. Of course, the actual palisade has since decayed and such. They've put a little bit of reconstruction, and then it's, I think, basically along here. There is a gravel path or an area marked, if you visit the site, where it says, follow this, and this is where the palisade once stood, so you can get a sense for just how large it was. So this is standing on top of that big mound. It's called Monk's Mound, the Chieftain's Mound, and it extends all the way this way down to back to where the trees are. Even includes what, I don't know if you can see, there's another mound right here. I'm going to advance the slide so we can look at it. There's a mound right there, so the palisade would have gone around behind it. There's a large area. Another thing I noticed, again, the architectural message that these people sent, the Natchez, the Mississippian culture. If you stand in the central precinct, which the guide, the visitor center, the website and such will tell you this was an area, I think, of the ball game. They actually flattened the area for performances and such. There's lots of mounds that surround the precinct. So, or I should say in the precinct, but surround the central area. So that if you're standing in the middle, I already mentioned talking about in the middle, looking at Monk's Mound, it's this sprawl that constantly says, look at me. But almost anywhere you are in this area, there's some sort of mound grabbing your attention. In other words, it's a constant reminder of, you're down here, I'm up here, because there would have been people on top of these mounds. So wherever you're walking in this area, especially as you get closer and closer to the Chieftain's Mound, there's a constant subliminal message of where you belong and where they belong. They're up there, you're down here. There's a constant sense of hierarchy. One thing that struck me is, at first maybe humorous and then more of a puzzle. So if you're standing on Monk's Mound, or if you visit the site, you can park here by the visitor center. You can park off screen this way. There's another parking lot there. There's a warning sign that says to all modern visitors, of course, don't go up on Monk's Mound during a storm. 100 feet high, there's a danger of lightning strikes. I thought, interesting. If you use the augmented reality and you're standing on top of the mound, there's specific stations where it says pull up your phone, scan this code. You can now look at this area. What they show is there once was a pole on top of the Chieftain's Mound, Monk's Mound, which of course we know a pole would be a natural attractant for lightning strikes. So if you've got this chieftain who's reminding the people under him, as well as any visitors who come through his town, biggest city north of the Rio Grande, pre-European era, 10 to 15,000 people, who's in charge, and then one day lightning hits, he dies, how would that affect people's perception of him? How would that affect their sense of, how powerful is this guy? And I think the answer is behind this mound. There's a low, fairly nondescript mound. You can see how tall this is by the trees and such. There's a nondescript low mound behind it that doesn't look like much until you find out what was inside after excavation. And it's evidence of royalty, basically, but also over 100, 150 sacrificial victims. That, I think, is the answer, ultimately, as to how this people group, Mississippians, I think these are the Natchez, continuously asserted their dominance and power. You sacrifice people. That's who's ruling this area when the Algics first come through. Another thought I had while here that gave me context. My mother's German. We visited Germany many times. Neuschwanstein Castle, which is the basis for the Disneyland Castle, is something you can visit. And I'm not showing you the inside of the castle because they forbid photo taking, so you have to use your imagination here. The throne room of Neuschwanstein Castle also conveys a very clear subliminal message. On the tour, they take you, and probably as any visitor would, to the throne room of this castle. The throne room itself has a very high ceiling. And the king itself would sit on an elevated throne, and there's all sorts of gold behind him. It's a spectacular sight. But the visitors are escorted into this throne room through an open hallway, but there's a low ceiling over you, so you can't quite see. You're always kind of looking around, looking up. I think the point is to make you feel kind of low. And then finally, when you step right before the throne, it opens up, and the king is before you, above you. The king, in his architecture, did a very good job at Neuschwanstein, letting every visitor know he was in charge and they had to be submissive to him. I think that's exactly the same type of thought that the Cahokians, the Mississippians, the Natchez had when they constructed the central precinct, the mounds around it, and the chieftain himself constructing this gigantic monk's mound. Question, of course, is why did this empire not last? You may have noticed, if you look carefully at this map, the dates stop basically by the 1200s. What I didn't tell you in our previous episode, that I'm going to tell you now, is the Algics, who were fighting a lot of battles on the Great Plains, fighting the North Walkers in the early 1200s, got tired of war and moved eastward, where they confronted the Cahokians. Actually, the Algic records say we confronted the Telegas. The Telegas, they said, possessed the East. And if you look at the Mississippian culture, that's the East. If you look at the Natchez, say they covered, that's the East. It's a pretty clear identification. The Natchez say, we came to the Mississippi, we confronted or engaged the people that we call the Telegas, who possess the East, and we ask for land eastward. Basically a diplomatic approach. Can we please, could you allow us passage? And the Natchez, as you might guess, responded by massacring them. They killed them. The Algic records describe the massacre. It's not just a rosy picture of everything's great. There's clear examples of we lost, there was evil, also victories. But in this case, they say, we got massacred by these Telegas, the Natchez people, the Mississippians. If you look at archaeology, this region, which includes Cahokia and some of the surrounding ones, in the centuries following the AD 1200s, became known as the vacant quarter. This again was core, if we go back to this map of the Mississippians, this was core Mississippian country, one of the oldest parts of it. That's where it all got started, and after the 1200s, it becomes the vacant quarter. Cahokia itself, archaeologically, began to be abandoned in the AD 1300s. If you go to some of these other flat-topped mound sites, Moundsville fell around the same time as Cahokia did. What happened after that massacre of the Algonquian peoples? Some of the clues, I think, come from the north. I mentioned Aztalan, which is in Wisconsin, also a flat-top mound site. Archaeologically, Aztalan looks like it was never completely Mississippian. The archaeology shows a mixture of cultures, and the archaeologists talk about and use the term, it's as if there were missionaries from Cahokia who came in, didn't seem to ever quite fully convert the people to the Mississippian culture. My contention would be, it seems like they did accomplish something because they built flat-top mounds. So they achieved some level of, we're in charge, it seems. But this site was burned before Cahokia was. In the early 1200s, Aztalan was burned. So if you look at the archaeological sequence in terms of timing, Aztalan falls, and then archaeologically, Cahokia and Moundville begin to be abandoned in the 1300s. Early 1200s in the north, 1300s further south. This is exactly in line with what the Red Record describes as to what happens. So if you're thinking about what could be cause-effect, maybe whatever was the cause started up in the north and then had these effects as we went southward. The Algic records describe saying we got allies, we got help from the north, specifically. They allied with us and helped us eventually overthrow this Talega people, the Mississippians. Who was up there? Who was up in the north? Who were these critical allies for this great battle at this seat of an empire? At contact, the Lakota, people like Sitting Bull and such, were on the Great Plains. So they would be out here in the Dakotas, Nebraska area and such. They were not down here at St. Louis. But you'll notice, of course, there, if you can read these names, this bluish, purplish color, the Osage were present around this region, the Missouri, Iowa. They're close to this Cahokia region. Let's start to break down their history because there's some critical clues that answer our questions. In our previous episode, we talked about language hierarchies. There is a language hierarchy in this linguistic grouping. So the Lakota, I think they'd be part of, I forget if it's either the Yankton or the Teton subgrouping, but they're out here on the plains. They're part of a linguistic hierarchy. This is how it breaks down. I've got the colors and numbers here. This is the Siouan-Catawban language family to which they belong. The Catawbans would be out here on the east coast. You've got others like the number 2 here. This would be the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and the Crow. Lakota are in this 4th grouping. You've got other groups that I didn't really learn much about growing up, like the Tutelo, Saponi, Ofo, others. Anyway, the point being there's a language hierarchy, and to make a long story short, the best linguistic explanation, I think, for the origin of all of these peoples is somewhere east of the Mississippi. That's in technical terms, the most parsimonious explanation, I think, for the origin of these peoples. That's fascinating because the peoples themselves have indigenous histories that describe coming from the east. In fact, you can connect them all the way to where Washington, D.C. now sits, and further north, the earliest records or the earliest accounts, if you go the furthest back in time, they say we came from the north, came down to D.C., and then went westward. The arrows here are pointing eastward to trace where the contact era peoples say they originally came from. Out here. So language and indigenous histories say the same thing. We'll come back to that in a minute in terms of the origins of Lakota and such. Where were they? And what does this have to do with Cahokia? Let me bring in another archaeological phenomena. The Oneota culture was in the Wisconsin, northern Illinois, southern Minnesota, Iowa region. Archaeologically, you can see a spreading of the Oneota culture from north to south. So let's put the pieces together. You've got Aslan in Wisconsin, between Milwaukee and Madison, that's burned early 1200s. And then later in the 1300s, Cahokia, and then further south in Alabama, Moundville are abandoned. You have a archaeological culture that moves from north to south. So the archaeology for Aslan and others suggest maybe there's some sort of conqueror coming from north to south, laying waste or defeating these individual elements of the Mississippian culture. You've got the Algic saying we had allies from the north who came to our aid and helped us defeat these Talegas, these Cahokians, the Mississippian culture. You've got the Oneota culture that suggests there's a movement from north to south. Who built the Oneota culture? Now, in mainstream science, there is a linkage that's being discussed between the Oneota culture, that's archaeological culture, and members of the Siouan-Catawban language family. Peoples like the Iowa, the Oto, the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, the Missouri, and perhaps even the Ponca, and perhaps also the Santee Sioux, Dakotas. These are thought to have built the Oneota culture, which implies then these members of the Siouan-Catawban language family were going from north to south. If you put all these pieces together, along with their indigenous histories, this is a very plausible migration path that we can reconstruct. Late 800s, the Siouan-Catawbans, including the ancestors of the Lakota, peoples like Sitting Bull, were near modern Washington, D.C. By the late 1300s, after Cahokia is being abandoned, after Aztlan is burned, after Moundville is being abandoned, peoples like the Osage, Quapaw, Kansas, Missouri, others say we separated at the mouth of the Ohio. So where the Ohio, of course, comes along the northern part of Kentucky, or empties into the Mississippi, they say we came from there, and it was about the late AD 1300s. Make a long story short, I think the pathway of migration from the AD 800s to the 1300s goes along this magenta arrow path. I want to make a point here that these dates straddle the rise and fall of the Mississippians. So if they started in the east but ended up in the west, at some point they're going to have to cross paths with the Mississippians, or they're going to have to try to avoid them some way. And I think the easiest way to avoid the Mississippians would be to hug the Great Lakes region, stick up here to the northern part of Indiana, Ohio. Again, because I think this is Oneida culture they eventually built. They eventually ended up in Wisconsin. And these are the people that burned Aztalan, began to defeat the Mississippian culture, came to the aid of the Algonquins, the Algic peoples, fought the greatest battle in pre-European North American history at Cahokia, defeated Cahokia. So here's Aztalan again, they got burned, defeated Cahokia. That's the cause of Cahokia being abandoned in the late, or in the 1300s. You're not going to hear this in mainstream science. I don't think they have the tools, the right time scale to be able to figure this out and put the pieces together. But it was the ancestors of Sitting Bull who, at the time of contact with the unrivaled rulers of the Great Plains, 800 years prior, before the Wild West, their ancestors were the critical allies of helping the Algic defeat the Mississippian, the Natchez Empire, and allow the Algics to proceed eastward. I said this is the episode with the biggest, the greatest hero in all of pre-European North American history. The Algic records tell us the names. It's part of the reason I titled the book They Had Names, because now we have the ability to not just say, here are certain people groups at this point in time fighting these battles, but we know the individuals involved. This is from David McCutcheon's 1993 translation of the Red Record, the Delaware document we discussed in the previous episode. They use a naming convention that would be familiar to you if you've ever studied Native American history, even post-contact history. So I mentioned a naming convention just a few slides ago. Sitting Bull is that descriptive Native American naming style. Crazy Horse, a descriptive Native American naming style. One of my favorites is Man Afraid of His Horses, named from one of the Siouan leaders, descriptive naming style. Same thing is practiced hundreds of years prior. Stirring was the sachem or leader or chieftain. Extremely strong were the Telegas. That's the chieftains, or the Natchez or Mississippians. They possessed the East. Breaking Open was the sachem, capturing all the great towns. And I should add here, the sachems before these stanzas are where they describe, hey, we were massacred. We lost. We asked for land and they murdered us. And here, of course, fittingly named, the Crusher was the sachem. Southward fled all the Telegas, which seems to still fit this. Burned in the north, and the defeats kind of fall like dominoes in a southward direction. Here we have the greatest hero in all of pre-European North American history. If you'd like to help us continue to unravel this history, again, for me, the key questions going forward are there more indigenous histories that might allow us to put these pieces together? Is there more DNA we can test? If you'd like to explore this with me, you can contact me through this website, answersingenesis.org/go/they-had-names. If you scroll down to that page, you can find a name to put your, or a place to put your name and email, as well as the message goes directly to my inbox. Contact me commits you to nothing. I've had people contact me from about 30 or so tribes. So we've got a community being built up. Eventually, we'd like to continue to explore DNA research, but again, this is, I understand there's lots of questions about DNA research. This is simply a way to get in touch with me, and we can just talk. You're not committed to anything. This map that I've referenced, you can find at that same website, answersingenesis.org/go/they-had-names. We have it for sale too if you like posters, printed form. You can find more episodes in this series on our playlist. So go to our main Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, and then find Playlists tab and find the playlist They Had Names for previous episodes. Again, this follows on breaking news, new research being published in this book, They Had Names. This follows on from a previous book looking at the global history of humanity through DNA with this book Traced. I've also published a book on the origin of species, 2017, made predictions that this research is now fulfilling. You can find the Cliff Notes version here. You can follow me on social media on multiple platforms. And if you've been following us in order, you may have noticed that we've covered a lot of Canada, that's a lot of the Algonquian peoples, northwestern Canada, Alaska, eastern United States. There's one region we've basically ignored, and that's the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Utah, and such, even spilling over into the nation, what's now modern Mexico. This is one of the places with the greatest pre-European ruins. The cliff dwellers have provoked all sorts of mystery and fascination for years. Join us in episode 5, where we try to solve the mystery of the cliff dwellers. I'm Nathaniel Jeanson. Thank you so much for joining us.